Well, we don't, in many respects, need to deal with it. Not least of all because it is the monarch that is the key to this.
A storm erupts
Behind the tall gates and quiet halls of the palace, something deeply unsettling began to take shape. The public image of calm, tradition, and unity no longer matched the reality unfolding inside. This was not a loud crisis. There were no public arguments, no shouting matches, no headlines announcing chaos. Instead, it was a slow and heavy shift, felt only by those closest to the center of power. Princess Anne was one of the first to recognize it. Known for her discipline, her loyalty, and her refusal to seek attention, Anne had spent her life serving the monarchy without complaint. She was not someone who acted on emotion or rumor. She believed in order, structure, and responsibility. That is why when she finally chose to speak up, it carried extraordinary weight. Those around her noticed changes long before any words were spoken. Anne became more watchful. Her conversations grew shorter but more focused. Meetings that once followed familiar patterns now felt tense. According to palace insiders, Anne sensed that the balance inside the royal household was quietly shifting. Decisions were being influenced in new ways. Traditional processes were being bypassed. What troubled her most was not disagreement, but direction. Power, she believed, was drifting without clear boundaries. And in a monarchy built on balance and restraint, that drift could become dangerous. Anne did not act suddenly. She observed, she listened, she compared what was happening to what should have been happening. Over time, it became clear to her that silence was no longer an option. The issue was no longer personal. It was institutional. This was not about family conflict or private disagreement. It was about the future shape of the monarchy itself. According to sources close to palace operations, Anne reached a moment where restraint began to feel like neglect. And for someone whose entire life had been defined by duty, that realization was deeply unsettling. When Anne finally reached out for help, she did so quietly and carefully. There was no public announcement, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, she contacted a small circle of senior palace authorities and trusted advisors. Her message was calm but urgent. She made it clear that the situation had reached a point where intervention was necessary. She was not asking for protection or personal support. She was sounding an alarm. Something within the structure of power was changing, and it needed to be addressed before it became permanent. At the center of her concern stood Queen Camilla. Anne did not accuse her openly or emotionally. She did not frame her concerns as gossip or suspicion. Instead, she pointed to patterns. According to insiders, these included decisions made without proper consultation, influence extending beyond traditional roles, and discussions about future arrangements that appeared to move ahead without clear approval. Anne believed that these actions, taken together, represented a shift that could no longer be ignored. What made Anne's warning so powerful was the way it was delivered. There was no anger in her voice, no attempt to dramatize the situation. Her words were precise, measured, and deeply serious. Those who listened understood that this was not a moment of panic. It was the result of long observation and careful judgment. Anne believed time was running out. If nothing was done, the consequences could reshape the monarchy in ways that could not easily be reversed. Traditionally, royal conflicts are handled quietly. Advisors smooth tensions. Disagreements are buried beneath layers of protocol and silence. But Anne believed that silence, in this case, would be a betrayal of duty. Waiting would only allow the problem to grow. Her warning marked a rare and significant break from royal tradition. By speaking up, she opened the door to a conflict that could no longer be contained behind closed doors. As her message moved through the highest levels of palace authority, the atmosphere changed. Conversations became guarded. Meetings took on new urgency. Questions began to surface that few were prepared to answer. What exactly was happening behind the scenes? How far had influence already shifted? And why had Princess Anne, the monarchy's most reliable guardian of order, decided that this moment demanded action? One thing was certain: the calm image presented to the world no longer reflected the truth inside palace walls. A confrontation was forming, not loud, not public, but serious enough to threaten the stability of the crown itself. And with her warning, Princess Anne had taken the first irreversible step toward exposing a crisis that could no longer be ignored. What followed Princess Anne's warning surprised even those closest to the throne. Many expected quiet negotiations, gentle corrections, or behind-the-scenes adjustments. Instead, King Charles made a decision that few believed he would ever make. According to sources familiar with internal palace matters, the king authorized a formal internal challenge against Queen Camilla. This was not a public lawsuit. There were no press statements or legal announcements. But within the palace, its significance was unmistakable. This action was described as a sealed institutional process, supported by royal authority, legal advisors, and constitutional precedent. Its purpose was not to punish, but to establish boundaries. King Charles, long known for his cautious and thoughtful nature, believed that persuasion alone was no longer enough. Structure and documentation were now required. For a reigning monarch to take such formal steps against his own queen was almost unthinkable in modern royal history. The shock spread quietly through palace corridors. Advisors struggled to understand the implications. Alliances shifted. Conversations were measured carefully. Everyone understood that a line had been drawn. Once crossed, it could not easily be erased. This was no longer a private disagreement. It was an institutional reckoning. At the heart of this escalation was a private letter written by King Charles himself. The letter, handwritten and deeply personal, was never meant for public eyes. It was written during a period of reflection and concern. Within its pages, the king outlined worries about authority, loyalty, and influence. He noted decisions made without consultation, private channels operating beyond approved structures, and discussions about future power that troubled him deeply. What made the letter so powerful was its clarity. It was not emotional, it was precise. Dates were recorded, meetings were referenced, conversations were recalled in careful detail. This was not suspicion, it was documentation. Understanding its importance, King Charles entrusted the letter to Princess Anne. The choice was deliberate. Anne was not driven by ambition or politics. She was trusted to protect the truth. The letter was not meant to be used immediately. Anne was instructed to safeguard it, only releasing it if silence itself became dangerous. As tensions continued to rise and concerns remained unaddressed, that moment arrived. The letter moved from private reflection to foundational evidence. It provided moral and procedural justification for the king's actions. It showed that this decision was not sudden, but the result of long consideration. When the letter entered the internal process, its impact was immediate. Advisors who had dismissed earlier concerns fell silent. Legal teams adjusted their approach. The narrative shifted. What had appeared to be a power struggle now became a documented breach of trust. The king's own words anchored the challenge in legitimacy. For Princess Anne, the weight of this responsibility was immense. Releasing the letter would permanently change relationships within the royal household. But withholding it would allow the issues it described to deepen. Her role was never about choosing sides. It was about ensuring that truth was not buried for convenience. As the process unfolded, attention turned toward Queen Camilla's growing influence. Her rise within the monarchy had been gradual and strategic. She cultivated relationships carefully. She understood timing. Others saw ambition. Over time, her access expanded, and with it, her role in shaping decisions. According to insiders, the concern was not her intent, but momentum. Influence once gained began to justify itself. Consultations were bypassed. Decisions grew more independent. Discussions about the future extended beyond the king's active reign. To Camilla, these actions may have felt necessary for stability. To others, they represented overreach. No one framed Camilla as a villain. The issue was not malice, but unchecked consolidation of power. History had shown that monarchies survive by limiting individual control. Anne recognized that danger clearly. By the time the internal challenge took shape, the question was no longer whether a line had been crossed, but how far power had already drifted. The monarchy now stood at a crossroads. Silence was no longer possible, and once taken, it would reshape how loyalty, authority, and accountability were understood inside the crown. As the internal proceedings advanced, the palace transformed. Once a symbol of tradition and certainty, it now felt tense and unsettled. Corridors filled with hurried footsteps. Legal teams reviewed documents late into the night. Advisors weighed every word carefully. The monarchy, long protected by silence, was now examining itself. Princess Anne emerged as the moral center of the conflict. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek attention. Instead, she presented records, notes, and testimony with calm precision. Each piece of evidence traced patterns of influence and decision-making. Witnesses confirmed timelines. Documentation spoke where emotion could not. Camilla, aware of the stakes, worked quietly to defend her position. Her team questioned Anne's motives, suggesting personal grievance rather than institutional concern. But Anne's approach was methodical. She released information in careful stages, anticipating each challenge. Her focus remained on one message. This was about protecting the monarchy, not winning a personal battle. King Charles, burdened by history and responsibility, observed with measured authority. The strain was visible. This was not a conflict he had wanted, but it was one he believed necessary. The proceedings were no longer about individual roles. They were about the integrity of the crown itself. The questions raised were profound. Could loyalty exist without accountability? Could tradition survive unchecked influence? Was the monarchy capable of correcting itself without public collapse? Each decision carried weight far beyond the palace walls. As testimony unfolded, it became clear that this was more than a procedural challenge. It was a mirror held up to the institution. The monarchy was being forced to confront its own weaknesses. The outcome would shape not just relationships, but the future balance of power. Regardless of the final resolution, one truth was undeniable. Princess Anne's decision to speak had changed everything. Silence had been broken. Boundaries had been questioned. And the monarchy had been forced to reckon with itself. The crown, once unshakable, now stood on uncertain ground. Whether it would emerge stronger or fractured depended on the choices made in this defining moment. History would remember not just the verdict, but the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. And so the question remains, when power drifts quietly, who is brave enough to stop it? And when silence protects influence, who truly serves the crown? As the internal process moved forward, a new reality settled over the palace. This was no longer a single conflict between individuals. It had become a test of influence, loyalty, and survival. The monarchy, an institution built on tradition and careful balance, now faced something it rarely confronted openly: resistance from within. Not loud, not public, but subtle and strategic. Those who had benefited from the existing structure, or feared what change might expose, began to move quietly. Their goal was not confrontation, but delay. Not denial, but confusion. Princess Anne felt this shift almost immediately. Meetings that once flowed smoothly became slower. Questions were repeated. Requests for clarification multiplied. Small procedural obstacles appeared where none had existed before. According to insiders, these were not accidents. They were tactics. Resistance did not announce itself with rejection. It showed up as hesitation, reinterpretation, and selective memory. Anne understood this well. She had seen it before in other institutional struggles. When truth threatens power, power rarely fights openly. It stalls. Despite this, Anne remained steady. She did not respond with frustration or emotion. Instead, she adjusted her approach. Documentation became even more detailed. Conversations were recorded more carefully. Every statement was supported by records. She knew that credibility would be her greatest defense. The more resistance she encountered, the more disciplined she became. Her focus never wavered from her central concern, protecting the monarchy from long-term harm. At the same time, Queen Camilla's position grew increasingly complex. Publicly, nothing had changed. Appearances continued. Smiles were maintained. The image of unity remained intact. But privately, pressure mounted. Her advisors worked tirelessly to contain the situation. They questioned the scope of the internal process. They challenged interpretations of authority. They emphasized loyalty, tradition, and the importance of presenting a united front to the public. Their message was simple. Disruption posed greater risk than compromise. Camilla herself, according to those close to the situation, did not see herself as acting against the crown. She believed her actions had been necessary. In her view, the monarchy needed strength, continuity, and preparation for the future. She believed she had stepped in where others hesitated. This conviction made the conflict harder to resolve. When two sides believe they are acting in the institution's best interest, compromise becomes difficult. Meanwhile, King Charles found himself at the center of a storm he could not escape. Every decision carried personal, institutional, and historical weight. He was not only a husband and father, but a monarch bound by centuries of precedent. Those close to him described long periods of reflection. The burden of leadership pressed heavily. He understood that whatever happened next would define his reign. The palace atmosphere grew heavier by the day. Staff moved cautiously. Conversations lowered in volume. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. Even long-standing relationships felt strained. The internal process had done what few events ever had. It exposed the fragile human structure beneath the crown. Princess Anne, watching this unfold, felt the cost of her decision deeply. She had never sought conflict, yet she knew that stepping back now would undo everything. The resistance she faced only confirmed her belief that silence had allowed imbalance to grow. If this process failed, the message would be clear. Influence mattered more than accountability. As weeks passed, the internal struggle reached a critical phase. Evidence had been presented. Positions were known. The question was no longer what had happened, but what the monarchy was willing to confront. Would it protect truth, even at personal cost? Or would it retreat into silence, preserving appearance at the expense of integrity? The palace stood at a tipping point, and everyone involved understood that whatever decision came next would echo far beyond its walls. While the internal process continued behind closed doors, the outside world remained largely unaware of the depth of the crisis. The monarchy's greatest strength had always been its ability to control narrative. Appearances were carefully managed. Public engagements continued. Smiles reassured the public. Stability was projected with precision. But inside the palace, the gap between image and reality widened dangerously. This contrast weighed heavily on Princess Anne. She understood the importance of public confidence, but she also knew that image without substance could not last. The longer the truth remained buried, the greater the eventual damage would be. According to insiders, Anne worried less about headlines and more about history. How would this moment be remembered? As a correction that strengthened the institution, or a missed opportunity that allowed imbalance to harden into legacy? Queen Camilla's public silence became a focal point of speculation. She did not address the situation directly. She did not deny allegations publicly. Instead, she maintained dignity and restraint. To many, this appeared wise. Silence avoided escalation, but internally it raised questions. Silence can protect, but it can also conceal, and in moments of institutional crisis, concealment can deepen mistrust. King Charles faced increasing pressure from multiple directions. Advisors urged caution. Some argued that pushing forward risked public fallout. Others warned that retreat would undermine authority. The king was forced to confront a painful reality. Leadership sometimes requires choosing the least damaging path, not the most comfortable one. As internal discussions intensified, the meaning of loyalty came under scrutiny. Was loyalty obedience, or was it honesty? Princess Anne believed loyalty meant telling the truth, even when it was unwelcome. Others believed loyalty meant preserving unity at all costs. This difference in definition lay at the heart of the conflict. The internal process revealed uncomfortable patterns. Not dramatic betrayals, but gradual shifts. Influence that expanded quietly. Decisions that accumulated without oversight. Each individual action seemed reasonable. Together they formed a troubling picture. Power had not been seized. It had been allowed. This realization unsettled many within the palace. It suggested that the monarchy's greatest vulnerability was not external criticism, but internal complacency. Systems built on trust require constant vigilance. Without it, they drift. Princess Anne's role became increasingly isolating. She was respected, but not always supported. Some viewed her as disruptive, others saw her as necessary. She accepted this loneliness as part of duty. Leadership, she believed, was not about comfort. It was about responsibility. As the process neared its conclusion, tension reached its peak. The palace felt suspended between two futures, one where boundaries were reaffirmed and lessons learned, another where silence prevailed and imbalance became permanent. No matter the outcome, one truth had already emerged. The monarchy could no longer claim innocence of its internal struggles. It had been forced to look inward. And once an institution sees itself clearly, it cannot return to ignorance. The final phase of the internal process arrived without ceremony. There were no cameras, no announcements, no dramatic reveal. This was not a moment designed for public consumption. It was a reckoning meant for the institution itself. Those present understood the gravity. Decisions made here would shape behavior, boundaries, and trust for years to come. Princess Anne presented her final position with calm clarity. She did not demand punishment. She did not seek victory. Her focus remained unchanged. The monarchy needed structure, limits, and accountability. Without them, power would continue to drift. Her words carried weight because they were consistent. She had never wavered. Queen Camilla's response emphasized intention and loyalty. She argued that her actions had been driven by concern for stability. Her defense highlighted a central truth of the conflict. This was not about evil intent, but conflicting visions of leadership. King Charles listened, observed, reflected. His role was not to please, but to decide. According to those familiar with the outcome, the resolution focused on correction rather than condemnation. Boundaries were clarified. Processes were reinforced. Influence was redefined. The goal was not to punish the past, but to protect the future. The monarchy emerged changed. Not broken, but altered. Silence had been challenged. Authority had been examined. Responsibility had been reaffirmed. The institution had proven capable of self-correction, though not without cost. Princess Anne returned to her role quietly. No recognition followed. No public acknowledgement. That was how she preferred it. Her reward was knowing she had acted when it mattered most. The public may never know the full details of what happened behind palace walls, but history will reflect the moment when silence was broken, when loyalty was tested, and when the monarchy chose reflection over denial. In the end, the crown survived not because it avoided conflict, but because someone had the courage to confront it. And that is the lesson this story leaves behind. Power must be watched, silence must be questioned, and true loyalty sometimes requires standing alone. When the internal process finally ended, the palace did not celebrate, explain, or reflect publicly. Instead, it returned to silence. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged. Public schedules resumed. Ceremonies continued. Photographs showed calm expressions and careful unity. To the outside world, the monarchy seemed stable, untouched by crisis. But inside the palace, nothing was quite the same. Those who had lived through the quiet struggle understood that a line had been crossed and redrawn. Power had been questioned, boundaries had been clarified, and silence, once taken for granted, had lost its innocence. Princess Anne felt this change most deeply. Though her role in the conflict had ended, its weight lingered. She returned to her duties without comment or recognition, exactly as she always had. Yet those closest to her noticed a subtle shift. Not regret, but resolve. She had done what she believed was necessary, even knowing the cost. Relationships within the palace were altered. Some grew more distant, others, unexpectedly, grew stronger. Truth has a way of revealing where loyalty truly lies. For King Charles, the aftermath was marked by reflection. He had faced a test few monarchs encounter so early in their reign. Balancing personal bonds with institutional responsibility had forced difficult choices. According to insiders, the experience left him more cautious, but also more aware. Authority, he realized, is not sustained by tradition alone. It requires constant attention, clear limits, and the courage to act when those limits are tested. The crown, though powerful, is also fragile. It depends not just on public respect, but on internal trust. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, adjusted to the new boundaries quietly. There were no dramatic changes visible to the public. But internally, roles were more clearly defined. Processes that had once been flexible were now formalized. Consultations became mandatory rather than optional. Influence was present, but contained. Those close to the situation described this period as one of recalibration rather than punishment. The goal was stability, not humiliation. Still, the shift was unmistakable. Momentum that once flowed freely now moved within tighter channels. The wider palace community absorbed the lessons carefully. Staff members became more cautious, more attentive to process. Advisors documented decisions more thoroughly. Informal arrangements gave way to written approvals. The crisis had revealed how easily assumptions could replace oversight. In response, the institution chose discipline, not because it wanted control, but because it had learned the cost of complacency. What made this moment unique was not that a conflict occurred, but that it was addressed internally before it became public catastrophe. History is filled with monarchies that ignored warning signs until collapse followed. This time, intervention came early. Not without strain, not without sacrifice, but with intent. Princess Anne's decision to speak had created a pause, a chance to correct course before damage became irreversible.